Welcome to Oseredok, Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center. Вітаємо вас усіх до Oseredku. My name is Olenka, and I'd like to welcome you to our Vyshyvanka Day Lecture series. Щиро дякуємо, що ви з нами святкуєте День Вишиванки. Oseredok is dedicated to being a forum for Ukrainian culture and education in our community. We're excited for the opportunity to share Vyshyvanka Day with you online through active and engaged scholarship. In this video, Katya Chomitzky will be presenting her lecture, The Patterns of Independence, Traditional Ukrainian Embroidery in Modern Fashion. Katya is currently a second-year Masters of Arts candidate in Modern Languages and Cultural Studies and a research assistant at the Kule Folklore Centre at the University of Alberta. Having completed her undergraduate degree with a major in political science and a minor in the history of art, design, and visual culture, Katya's research aims to connect the two worlds of traditional art and its political function. Specializing in media and cultural studies with a focus on post-Soviet decolonization, her current research interests are in cultural preservation, cultural revival, and material culture through the lens of derussification.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us in celebrating International Day of the Vyshyvanka. I am Katya Chomitzky, and I'm an MA candidate from the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies at the University of Alberta. Even though we are meeting digitally, we do so in solidarity of our histories and identities, which is an extremely important element of maintaining cultural integrity. I hope that you're all able to wear your Vyshyvanka at home today, or that you're participating in some expression of your culture and sharing it with others. Within my personal research, I look at the different ways that this solidarity and cultural unification, as demonstrated specifically through the revitalization of traditions, can act as a tool of decolonization, and more specifically in the Ukrainian case, of derussification. Today, I want to explore and share with you the ways the Vyshyvanka and the art of Ukrainian embroidery have been utilized to promote cultural unity amongst both national and diaspora Ukrainians. Specifically, I want to look at the ways in which they are able to derussify the identity and regain the cultural sovereignty that faced eradication throughout the Soviet period. While Vyshyvanka Day has been celebrated since 2006, the event has become increasingly popular due to the current political landscape within Ukraine. Particularly, this started to happen following the events of the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity in 2014. When looking at the cultural availability of products with embroidery patterns on them, we see not only hand and machine embroidery on clothing, but we also see faux embroidery in screen patterns printed on a variety of objects, from salt and pepper shakers to coffee mugs. But why does the political turmoil affect our desire to wear Vyshyvanka and embroidered clothing, as well as to purchase objects with these patterns on them? Before I can discuss the ways in which embroidery has been revitalized and repopularized in modern fashion, I want to encourage you all to think of the ways in which cultural appropriation and colonization have affected not only the material cultures of so many different groups, but also how this manipulation of sacred, meaningful, and traditional objects can lead to the destruction of any sense of cultural unification, history, or community that a group may have. You can imagine how detrimental this would be to any group, as this act of dispossessing a people from their culture can work to validate the dominance of one society over another. Now, within the Ukrainian context, the introduction of Soviet policies and beliefs left little to no room for cultural uniquities and individualities. The idea is that if everybody appeared the same within the Soviet Socialist republics, the USSR could then justify the ways in which they colonized various other nations. The existing conversation surrounding colonization often focuses primarily on the geographical effects and implications. However, dominating and colonizing a cultural group is a much more extensive process than just simply the dispossession of land and of natural resources. In fact, attacking a social group through its culture is an effective tool of eradicating civilization entirely. Throughout the imposition of new standards, expectations, and regulations from the colonizing nation in many sections that include religion, education, land use, and economic practices, colonizers work towards the assimilation of one societal group into another. by eradicating any trace of history that the colonized group may have had, the existence and claims to autonomy become invalidated. Another popular tactic is the appropriation of cultural elements in order to dichotomize the colonized group, or in this case, Ukrainians, as lesser and subordinate to the dominant colonizing culture. And this emphasizes their value only as a commercial commodity and no longer as humans. This is often seen through the appropriation and eradication of traditional and sacred objects as an attack on their cultural value and meaning. It is this drastic displacement and dispossession of a group's traditions, identities, and histories which then affords colonizers the opportunity to impose their own histories and identity on these cultural communities. Although the Soviet Socialist republics were never colonies in the sense that we traditionally think about it, it is no stretch to consider the Soviet period as one of colonization, especially when considering the level of control and appropriation that occurred throughout the various Soviet states. However, it is the historical attachment of Ukraine and Russia in the period of the Rus, which spanned from the 8th century to the 13th century, that often blurs the lines between the two countries, particularly in the eyes of the West. In my research, I argue that the period of the Soviet Socialist republics is a period of colonization, both political and economic. The evidence is rooted in the numerous acts of genocide, cultural appropriation, and the forced assimilation of various ethnic groups under the Soviet regime. For this, I turn to Ian Law's Red Racisms, Racisms in Communist and Post-Communist Contexts, where the author makes the following statement relevant to the belief that the USSR acts as a colonial power over other Soviet states and republics. Quote, "The Russian state has, over centuries, constructed patterns of governance and domination that have been articulated through twin hierarchies of backwardness and civilization, multiple forms of racialization, ethnophilia, and primordialism, separations between Russia's West and its Orient, and the undercurrents of great Russian chauvinism." End quote. One of the largest proponents of Soviet colonization is that of Russification, meaning the efforts that are made in order to assimilate the other cultures and nations into the Russian identity. In an attempt to suppress the Ukrainian identity, traditional embroidery was suppressed as well. The traditional craft shifted, with most other technologies, into the factories of the Soviet Union for the sake of commodification. Among the many changes that took root in the Soviet republics was a concentrated effort to fully nationalize all Soviet industries, and one of the earliest nationalized industries just so happened to be textiles. Ukrainian artisans and the peasant class were then employed in artels to create and manufacture embroidered pieces, with a shift from the handcrafted to the mechanized embroidery that drastically changed the style and racialized the manufacturing of commodities. These embroidery factories, which were sponsored by the Ukrainian SSR, were opened with the intention of exporting the products. The Soviet Union's attempts at Russification took a toll on the embroidery of Ukrainians, particularly attacking the meaning behind the media. These pieces no longer held the spiritual or symbolic meanings that they had originated with. Instead, the work was sold within and outside of the Soviet Republic solely for a monetary gain, and the quality of folk embroidery declined as production methods were often inferior, and much harm was done by the use of carelessly printed patterns. A really strong example of this can be seen through the different manipulations of rushniki, or embroidered ritual cloths, and their designs. The ritual rushnik is a very important item that carries a lot of cultural significance, with the use of different embroidery symbols to represent different wishes in life. There is a great deal of importance placed on the role of rushniki, and during the Soviet period, the use of the rushnik was Russified and made it an object of political propaganda. In this time period, we begin to see text appearing on the ritual cloths, spreading political messages alongside various portraiture designs of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, and different images that unmistakably represent the USSR, such as the sickle and hammer. This shift towards new representative patterns acts as a form of erasure of the traditional meanings that rushniki once held. Replacing the history and meaning that embroidery once held within the political propaganda changes Ukrainian embroidery into a form of labor that can then be commodified, as opposed to this cultural tradition that celebrates heritage and identity. While the manipulation of cultural symbols by colonial powers can be an effective way to achieve domination over the culture as a whole, there is even more power in maintaining and reclaiming those elements as a form of rebellion. This is where the revitalization of the traditional Ukrainian embroidery comes into play. Journalist Vladislav Inozemtsev writes that, quote, the Soviet Union was brought down not so much by economic crisis or ideological disillusionment following the end of communism, as by its constitutive republic's attempts to reclaim sovereignty all at once. As I introduced earlier, there has been a large shift in clothing trends within Ukraine since the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity in 2014, from runway designers to everyday wear. In fact, Vyshyvanka Day, a day where Ukrainians around the world wear their traditionally embroidered shirts, is seen as a day that unites all Ukrainians speaking different languages and living in different parts of the world. Although not a public or religious holiday, this day, in any case, is a day of national unity. For a bit of context, a few years prior to the first Vyshyvanka Day, a Ukrainian citizen wearing their traditional clothing or vyshyvanki on the streets as everyday wear was not a common sight, and it would have been considered a costume at best. Traditional embroidery patterns are now utilized to represent not only their original meanings of protection, health, and happiness, but they also represent the Ukrainian culture as a whole throughout the nation and its various global diasporas. The continued use of these motifs and symbols in modern fashion demonstrates the rejection of the adoption of the mother country's cultural standards, which is a common goal of the process of colonization. We do see the remnants of the Soviet influence, with words often still being embroidered on rushniki, but there is no longer images of political leaders and propaganda messages that adorn these items. However, not all designers utilize these traditional patterns and fabrics and embellishments appropriately or for the same purpose. Even in modern times, we run into cultural appropriation of these objects. One designer in particular who has appropriated not only Ukrainian culture, but many others as well, is Valentino. In 2015, the high-end designer launched a fashion line that was allegedly inspired by Russian countryside. However, the embroidery more closely resembled the national patterns and dress styles of Ukraine, specifically designed in the fashion of the Vyshyvanka, the jupan, which is a long white coat typically decorated embroidery, and the keptar, which is a sheepskin vest worn with the fur on the inside. The claims of the style as Russian not only insulted many people, but it demonstrates the long-standing history of the colonial impression that Russia has attempted to deliver to the rest of the world, that Ukraine was a part of Russia. This collection caused a particular uproar as well, as within the previous year of 2014, Russia had not only illegally annexed Crimea from Ukraine and prevented the inclusion of Ukraine in the European Union, but they had also continued to attempt to annex Donbass from Ukraine through warfare. With the many examples of Ukrainian designers who were able to include the traditional embroidery as a communicative symbol of history, there was very little tolerance within the country for the mistakes of the well-known designer. Instead, designers such as Lena Ivanova, Olga Navrotsky, and Vita Kin are receiving national praise and recognition for their inclusion of the traditional motifs and symbols of embroidery as a statement about the national identity of Ukrainians. The trend that has often been designated simply as boho or bohemian reflects very strongly on Ukrainian traditions, and we see that through the creations of those Ukrainian designers. However, this movement is not simply a fashion statement, it is a statement of independence and unity amongst Ukrainians. Designer Ksenia Marchenko puts it best when she says, quote, "Being inspired by Ukrainian traditions is a huge trend here right now. Prints from spring 2015 and fall 2016 were our answer to the situation in Ukraine, revolution, and war." End quote. While Vidakian emphasizes that her line is not politically motivated, she did say that she wanted to create bohemian, picturesque, and life-affirming clothing that women would feel special in. Others overtly politicized their lines, like Novrotsky, who used bullets and slogans alongside her designs as a way to express solidarity with those who were fighting in Donbass and those who protested during the Maidan. Ivanova further states that she sees this as a new wave of tradition, as a chance for Ukraine to reclaim its heritage. By reviving the tradition of Ukrainian embroidery, these designers are able to not only share the meanings that accompany the designs, but they are also able to utilize them and create a rhetoric involving the importance of a unified cultural nationality. Ivanova is quoted pointing out the importance of maintaining tradition when she said, quote, "The traditions have so many interesting things, a lot of energy, that you can learn over and over again and use. We constantly try to reconsider and structure these traditions," end quote, emphasizing the growth of the communicative symbol and their modern application. The use of these traditional forms of folk art in fashion continues to reinforce the appropriation of culture, leaving the bitter taste of colonialism in the mouths of many. Others have found a way to work and connect with the traditional elements and the 21st century in a respectful way. Through the promotion of one's identity, through the return to traditional culture, we see a shift. By including these traditional forms of folk art in more than just a museum, cultures are able to reclaim their history and their meaning, creating a deeper understanding of not only the traditional culture, but its continued growth and life as well. The creativity of using modern elements has infused the art form with new vitality, incorporating both the new and traditional value, creating a multifaceted level of power that exists within the community. With the manipulation of meanings and traditions of embroidery in the Ukrainian culture, there have been many opportunities for the communicative symbol of the folk art to have been lost or manipulated in order to suit colonial tastes. However, there has been an element of power in the reclamation of these objects, allowing each of these groups to recreate, revive, and develop their own narrative surrounding histories, values, and lives. With many of the symbols retaining their traditional meanings, the use of objects for the sake of decolonization proves the cultural resilience of the ethnic groups, as well as the importance of those histories to teach each of them. The value of the visual representation of a culture screams to the masses that the culture is still alive, it is unique, and it is valuable. Ukrainians continue to work as a unified nation, and although they have been fragmented for many years, they continue to reject the colonial influences of the Soviet Union. Respectfully, the use of embroidery also communicates to the rest of the world that Ukrainian culture is here, it is alive, and it will continue to fight for decolonization and recognition as a sovereign state. Thank you all for joining me today. I hope I was able to provide you with some new and insightful information into the revitalization of the Vyshyvanka. I hope you have a great day, wear your Vyshyvanki proudly, and stay safe.